When you fetch data in React with libraries like SWR and React Query, you can easily have conditional logic like you see here, where we're checking the error state and the isLoading state before we go ahead and create JSX to render. But React Suspense and Error Boundaries can eliminate all of this. Today we'll learn how. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we'll refactor a simple web app and apply React Suspense and Error Boundaries. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. To quickly get started with this tutorial, grab the starter code from the link in the description. It's going to have two folders in the repository. One will say Suspense Complete, like you see up here in my VS Code. The other will say Suspense Starter. You want to start with the Suspense Starter directory, and I'm going to complete this code in this tutorial and include it in the GitHub repository as well. So you'll see the two folders there. And then once you have it open in VS Code, go ahead and open up a terminal, and we're going to start JSON server to be a dev REST API. And you can see I've got a data folder here, and I've got data inside the DB JSON file, and that's what we're going to use with JSON server. So you want to type npx, then JSON-server, then -w for watch, and then the data directory and the db.json file. Then I'll say -p and port 3500. That will start up JSON server, and we'll be able to get that data in our application. Then I'm going to click the plus symbol here in my terminal. You can see I'm using git bash, and I'm going to get a second git bash window. And there I'm going to type npm run dev to go ahead and start our project. And I've started it up with Vite is what I have used instead of create React app. So if you're using create React app, it may be npm start. But if you get my starter code, you're going to have Vite as well. So you want npm run dev to start this project. Once it starts, it says it's on localhost at port 5174. I can go ahead and click that while I hold down the control key, and it should launch it in the browser window, and you see that here. And so I'm going to drag that over, and once it's open, you can see we load the employees in our select dropdown here. And so we've already made one request to get the employees' names. After that, when I choose an employee, it selects all of the posts for that employee, but then it also goes and grabs the other data for the employee, includes some of that with the post data here as well. So we have author, tagline, some things I'm getting from the user data also. So we'll see how I'm doing all of that with SWR quickly inside of our code. Let's open up the source directory, and then in the components directory, we're going to look at the PostsList component. And so I'll scroll down just a little bit, and we can see when the component starts, it receives the current user ID. That's the one that would be selected from that drop-down menu. And then we've got two use SWR hooks. And the first one gets our post data. And you can see it receives the post cache key. It also gets that current user ID because we're only selecting the posts for that current user. And you can see they're passed in an array. And that's what you do with the use SWR hook when you have a parameter to pass in as well as the cache key. And then it composes a cache key based not only on the cache key that you've given it, but also on the parameter that you've provided. And so the second parameter here to the use SWR hook then is our function definition, and that receives the URL, which is this cache key. Then it receives the user ID parameter, which is the next parameter we passed into the array. And then it goes ahead and calls our get posts by user ID, and it receives the URL and the user ID. So we get that data as posts. Now the second use SWR hook is dependent on the first, and this is from the docs as well as far as how to do that. So we wait to see if we have post data. And if we do have post data, then this is a ternary statement, by the way. So if it's true, then we follow this same pattern here where we have the user's cache key and the current user ID. If it's not, it's just null and nothing is received yet. Essentially, the components are not ready yet to render. And we'll see how we check that with conditional logic here, and then we'll fix that and not use the conditional logic and use React Suspense instead. But we'll start out with that conditional logic. Now the second parameter here is much like we saw above. It is the function definition, and then we get user by ID so we can get that other user information. Now while we're here with these use SWR hooks, what we need to do today is enable React Suspense. And we can do that with the options argument that the use SWR hook can receive. So we'll put it in here in the third position, and we just say suspense, and we set that to true. And I'm going to do that for both of these hooks. So I'll just copy this down, and I will put it here as well. So we've enabled suspense for our use SWR hooks, and I didn't want that comma on a separate line, so I'll fix that. And so that's our first step. Now let's scroll down and look at that conditional logic we saw at the very beginning of the video. You can see I'm defining content with the keyword let so we can reassign it. And then we're looking at several things. First, we're checking the current user ID, and if it's equal to 0, that means no user has been selected. So we give that default message that's, I'll press Alt-Z by the way to wrap it so we can see everything, but we get that default message that says select an employee to view posts. And then we check the loading state. And since we have two hooks, we're checking the is loading state for posts. Then we're also checking the is loading state for user. And then we do the same for error and possibly a user error in the second hook if we were requesting that user data. And finally, we can define our JSX content. Well, be relieved to know we can get rid of all of this conditional logic that we have here once we apply an error boundary and React Suspense, and that's what we're going to do today. Now let's get started applying React Suspense by going to the parent component, which is the app.js, because that's where we actually have to apply it instead of inside of the PostsList where we have our use SWR hook. So at the top, I need to do a couple of imports. I'm going to import Suspense, and that comes from React. And after that, I need to import the skeleton post, which is what we show during loading. So I'll bring that component in as well. Save those quick imports, and I'm going to scroll down because we need to wrap our JSX content in the suspense. But before we wrap the post list in the suspense, let's go ahead and create a short conditional here at the top where we can check some of the things we were previously checking in the post list component. And one of those things is the current user ID because we still want to have a default message. So I'll say const and have a content. I'll set that equal to current user ID and check to see if it is equal, that's 3 equal signs, to 0. And I'm going to make a ternary statement out of this. So if that is true, if no employee has been selected, I'm going to go ahead and create an H2 with a class name of message. And then inside of this, I'm going to say select an employee to view posts, just so we have a default message there. Now, if that is all finished, I'll press Alt-Z again to wrap anything I need to. Then I'm going to have the false equivalent here, and this is where I'm going to create the JSX. So let's create a suspense component here. So I'll say suspense. And now I've got the opening and closing, and inside of this is where we would put the post list. So I'm going to select this that we have in the JSX below and bring that up here above now inside of this content that we're creating. Now suspense needs to receive a fallback, and that fallback is what we're going to show during loading. So I'll put this equals and I'll have curly braces. Inside of this, we could have a component we have created for fallback, or we could just have some JavaScript code if we are calling something. I'm going to have a little bit of both, but first I'm just going to show you what it looks like with just one component. So I'll put the skeleton post in, and after that we'll just close it out right here, and then we'll add in a little bit more JavaScript to go with that in just a minute. So now below we still need to put our content inside of the return JSX, so we'll put that content value right here and close it out. And it's fairly simple, isn't it? We've just wrapped our post list in suspense. Now this also applies to child components. Essentially all the children that are created in a tree below post list will have the suspense applied, and nothing will render until everything is ready. Until then, we would see this loading fallback component that we're providing here, which is the skeleton post. So let's see if this is working as expected. I'll drag this to the left, and we have our app here to the right. Let me reload it, and we're loading just the employees' names. Now let me choose an employee, and we get one skeleton post here while this information is loading, and then we get our post. So it is working as expected. So I just want to put in that extra JavaScript so we see a page full of those skeleton post components. I'll drag this back over, and let's say we want to show 10 of these components, the skeleton post. Now I did this in a separate video about loading skeleton components, and you could watch that video as well. I'll try to provide a link to that below also. But what I'm going to do right now is create an array, and inside this array, I'm going to spread in an array with 10 elements. Now right now, those 10 elements are undefined. And then if I say .keys, those are just the iterators of those elements. They would be 0 through 9. And notice we're spreading that into a new array here. And so then, now that I have an array with 10 elements, and those elements are the numbers 0 through 9, I can map over that. And here is the iterator, essentially what I am mapping. And I'm just going to call this map function. So I need an arrow. And notice it is wrapping down to the next line, of course. And then the skeleton post will need a key since we are mapping over them. And it can just be that iterator. And that's what I needed those numbers for. And then after that, we can just close out the whole map function. And so after the skeleton post closes actually is where I need that parentheses. And then we should be good. So we added just a little bit of JavaScript here. So we would map over 10 elements of an array, and then we would return 10 of these skeleton post components right there. Okay, now that we've done that, I'll save, and let me drag this back to the left. And I'm going to reload the app again. And notice we're loading the employees. I built in a small delay into every request, so we would absolutely see that loading phase. And now we're seeing the skeleton components, and then we get the posts. So that loading lasts almost 2 seconds. So I really wanted to make sure you could see that. And that's the delay I built in. Now notice though, I'll request another one, and SWR is going to cache these responses. So after this delay, let me go back to the previous employee that we had viewed. There's no delay now because we're getting a cached response. So if you see me refresh the page, it's just to get rid of those cached responses sometimes. Okay, bringing this back over to look at our code. Let's go ahead and remove all of the conditional logic that we currently have in the post list and make sure that everything is still working as we expect it to. And so now I want to remove all of this, even the let content all the way down here. We're not going to look at any of the error state, any of the loading state, or the ID value there. And we are just left with the hooks inside of our component until we get to the content. And I need to go ahead and define that with the keyword const now, because it's always going to be this, and we'll just return that content. And it looks like maybe I've got one extra curly brace here. Now everything looks better. And we've removed all of the conditionals now. Let's just make sure our app is still working as expected. I'll reload it. And we'll check it again. I've got a little bit of a long delay built in, but Suspense is still working as expected without that conditional, and that's good. But what Suspense doesn't do is catch any errors, and that's why we need to use error boundaries with that. And let me give an example of that, and I'll go down into a nested component right here. So our posts, and of course we create 10 of these post components as we go through those posts for each employee. And now let me put in something that doesn't exist, like a paragraph, and try to find a variable named Dave, for example. And now if we try to make our post render, we don't get anything on the page. The app just broke because we have an undefined variable. It says Dave is not defined, but this is what the user sees. It's a really bad user experience. You just get a blank page if we have an error. And that's not what we want at all. And we can fix these problems with an error boundary, and we can improve that user experience even if we have an error. So let's go to the package.json file, as we need to add a dependency. And you can see we have very few dependencies here from the starter code. Besides React and React DOM, we just have Axios and SWR. So now I'm going to open that terminal window again and Control-C to currently stop the app from running. And then I'm going to do npm I, and the package we're going to install is called React-Error-Boundary, and press enter. Shouldn't take long to add this dependency to our project. And now we see it listed up here as of the making of this tutorial. It is at 3.1.4. And then I'm just going to press the up arrow a couple of times and go back to npm run dev, press enter, start the application once again. It looks like it's on port 5173 now, so I will hold down Control and click to open that back up. And I'll close the previous one. So now we have the current version of the code running there in the browser window. And now the error boundary needs to run in the parent component also. So let's go back to the app.js. And back up at the top, I'm going to add another import. So I'm going to import error boundary from React Error Boundary. And now where we're creating our content, we have wrapped our post list in React Suspense here. And this wraps down to the next line, but that is one component, and here's the closing tag for that component. Now I want to wrap both the suspense and the post list in an error boundary. So here I'm going to create this and add error boundary. I'll close it out to get the closing tag, cut that with Control X, and then paste it with Control V underneath. But I want to add a fallback to the error boundary as well. So if we get an error, what are we going to display? So for now, I'll just say fallback, set this equal to something with curly braces again. And instead of creating a component for now, I'm just going to create a paragraph, and I'm going to give this a class name. There we go, equal to error. And then I'm going to say an error has occurred. And that's it. It's just our paragraph inside of there. So let me go back and put that error back inside of our post component here, where we had a paragraph, and inside of it we just had an undefined variable named Dave. Now I'll drag this over, and when we choose to display posts, we should have an error. Of course, it's putting the request in first, and we're waiting on suspense, and then we get an error has occurred. Now that's a better user experience. At least we have something showing on the page, but there's not much the user can do. So let's go back and improve this experience just a little bit. I'll drag this back over to see the code. Let's go back to the app.js and improve our error boundary. And actually what we want to do now is create a new component. So here inside of the components directory, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this error fallback.jsx. I'm going to start with React ES7 snippets and type RAFCE to get a functional component. But after that, I don't really have to think this through much, because in the documentation for React Error Boundary, we can see an example of this component. So I'm going to bring the browser back up, go to the NPM page for React Error Boundary. Let me make this full screen. It's a little bright because of the white background, but otherwise it's pretty good. So I'll scroll down and let's find this function. And here it is. So we've got function error fallback. It receives an error and a reset error boundary. And then this is what it returns. So I'm just going to grab the return section for now and drag this back over to the right and look at our code. Paste this in, and then what it receives at the top is the error, and it receives the reset error boundary. So that's the full component right there. It says something went wrong, it gives the user the message, and it has a function, reset error boundary, that can be launched with the click of a button. Now I am going to change this that has role alert. I'm going to change this to my class name that I've set up in my CSS for an error. Okay, let's go back to the app.js, and we'll use this fallback component as well. So we need to import that. So we're going to import error fallback that we just created. And after that, we can use that error fallback. Instead of the fallback attribute that we had here, we're going to use a different attribute, and it is called the fallback component. There we go. And so now that we have that, I'll delete the previous curly braces there, and we need to put in that error fallback that we have imported here. And it's going to automatically receive those two props that we positioned inside of the component, the error and the function to call. Well, I say automatically, but actually there's something we need to do for the function. It does receive that error without us having to do anything else. But let's go ahead and create that function. And what we want to do with that function is essentially reset state. And it is received from the onReset prop. So now we'll have equals and curly braces. Make this an anonymous function. Give it the arrow over, and we will just set current user ID. And what we want to do here is just reset the state back to 0, what it starts at right here at the top of our component. So if the user experiences an error, they're able to click a try again button, which will reset the state, hopefully back to a safe state that will let them continue to keep using the application. But there's one more prop that we can pass to the error boundary itself. It doesn't go into this error fallback component. It's just something the error boundary uses, and that is called reset keys. And this is kind of like a dependency array, if you will, but it's not so much a dependency array, it's just something that the error boundary looks at. So we're going to pass the current user ID in here. And if the current user ID changes, then the error boundary resets itself. So there is no more error. So now it doesn't have to be a result of the user clicking the try again button that changes the state, but that is one thing that could cause that. If the state changes, the error boundary is reset, and that causes a re-render, which hopefully would not show the error. So now let's drag this back to the left, and we'll look at our app once again. And we already see the new error boundary displaying here. It says something went wrong, Dave is not defined. Let's try this from the start. So we load in the employees. Because of that delay, we just wait a little bit. We're waiting on the post from Leanne, but we're going to get that error that Dave is not defined. Now, worth noting, that is not in the direct child, that is in the post component. So anything in the tree, once again, it catches the errors that the error boundary is wrapped around, and it passes them back up, and the user can actually use that. So I guess before I remove this error, let's see what the button does and look at the difference here. So we've got the error here. Now the user could say, I want to try again. Notice when I did that, it reset the state and it went back to the app just like it had just loaded. It's got that beginning state where the user ID is 0, so no employee is selected. Now, once we create the problem here, we're going to continue to have this problem where I have that undefined no matter which employee ID I select. So let me change the error just a little bit. Instead of an undefined variable like my name, let's have an error just based on one employee. So I'm going to say if the user ID is equal to 2, then we're going to throw new error, and we'll just say error number 2. Okay, so now we're only going to get this error if the user ID is equal to 2. So when we bring this back, I'll reload the app again. And now Leanne Graham is user number 1. We shouldn't have an error. We should see all of her posts once they are fetched. And we do. But we go to see user number 2, Irvin Howell, we'll probably get this error. And we did. Here's our error number 2. Now the user could reset the state here with try again, but notice our nav bar is still up here and it's still working. So we could also change the state with it. So let me just pick user number 3. So just as an example, our app didn't break. It doesn't necessarily require the use of that try again button that we see with user number 2, but the try again button does work as well. So it's a better user experience overall. So a quick review here, I'll drag our code back over. We have refactored our post list, and it no longer has a long stretch of conditional logic in it. It just has the content definition after the use SWR hooks here at the top of the component. And we can actually remove the is loading and error that we're receiving from both of these hooks and just receive the data. These are no longer needed because we have enabled suspense with use SWR in both of these in the options. And so now those errors are passed to the error boundary, and any loading state is caught with the suspense. So I'm going to save this, and we'll go back and look at the app.js. We added just a small conditional here, a ternary, to give our default message saying select an employee to view their posts. And otherwise, when we create JSX, this is it. It's an error boundary wrapped around our suspense, which is wrapped around our post list. And remember, it doesn't just impact the post list, it also impacts the full tree of subcomponents rendered underneath the post list as well. And just a couple of closing notes here, guys, things I want to highlight from the docs. So let me bring the websites over to full screen. And one thing about error boundaries is they do not catch all errors. There are a few specific errors they do not catch, so be prepared for that when I scroll down here and find the discussion. Yes, Error boundaries do not catch errors for event handlers. It says asynchronous code, but that's not quite right when it comes to use SWR. Notice we were passing the errors up, and that is an asynchronous fetch there. But if you had a custom hook that was using async await or something else asynchronous, as they mentioned, set timeout, request animation frame, it's not going to catch those. Server-side rendering and errors thrown in the body of the error boundary itself. So just a note, now there is one hook that comes with this library you could explore. Say you had your own custom fetch function and it was not SWR or the use SWR hook. You could use this use error handler and pass any error that came from your fetch to that. So that's one thing you can use with async code. And there's examples of how to do that. So I just wanted to highlight that. Now let's also go to the SWR docs for Suspense. And as I scroll to the top, it says React still doesn't recommend using Suspense in data frameworks like SWR, but of course they document how to use it here. And it just gives some more information. Really, they, of course, should point this out because React does go ahead and advocate for its use to fetch data in some things. It says opinionated frameworks like Relay, Next.js, Hydrogen, Remix, and it says still not recommended as a general strategy. So it's kind of up to you. You definitely want to be careful. You definitely want to use an error boundary if you do use Suspense. And while they're being very cautious here and not recommending it, at the same time, while I think it is prudent that SWR does highlight this warning, they go ahead and give you all of the details here about how to use Suspense with an error boundary in your code. So just be cautious as you do use it, and it's up to you. The final verdict for me is I think it's great if you can apply it like the docs show here, and you're always careful and use an error boundary. It's up to you if you want to decide to use it, but I would in small projects, and I would really use it with caution if it came to something like an enterprise project. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.